Hi everyone, welcome to today's Silverlight Show webinar. My name is Emil and I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar presenter, Brian Noyes. Brian has already delivered several WCF RIA Services webinars for Silverlight Show, recordings of which you can find at Silverlight Show webinars page. Today's webinar is about Prism and WCF RIA Services, two great toolkits that work great together. As usual, the session will continue for about 60 minutes with a short Q&A at the end. If you have any questions during the session, please feel welcome to send them using the chat option in your webinar panel. After the presentation, Brian will respond to as many questions we received as possible. Any remaining questions will get a personal response after the webinar. We have some ebook giveaways for joining our post-webinar survey and for tweeting this webinar. Telerik is also providing a special discount on their ad controls for Silverlight, but more details will follow up in the presentation. Okay, so Brian, shall we begin?
Sounds good. Thank you, Emil. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for showing up today for today's webinar. As the title says, the idea here is to answer a question I get fairly commonly, since I do a lot of speaking on Prism and was directly involved in the Prism development with the Microsoft team, and I also do a lot of writing and speaking on RIA services. People always sort of want to know, how do those two things fit together? They are designed to address sort of different goals, but there is some overlap in terms of where they would fit into your application and how you would tie them together. So this is mostly a conceptual talk. I will go to some what comes together in terms of projects and where these different things I'll be talking about live within the code. But first we're going to talk about some concepts. If you are brand new to Prism and or brand new to WCF RIA Services, don't worry, we're not going to get into any great depth in the code. Like I said, it's more big picture, how do you tie the different capabilities of these frameworks together. And I'll talk about what each one of those capabilities is for each framework, and then talk about how to mesh them together. Emil mentioned that there are some giveaways associated with this webcast I wanted to highlight here. You can go to silverlightshow.net ebooks, and they have a number of ebooks, including two based on my article series on WCF RIA Services and Prism 4. So those are available, and if you complete the post-webinar survey, you'll have a chance to win those free ebooks. Also, if you tweet webinar Silverlight Show, you have a chance of winning two ebooks from Packet Publishing, the Microsoft Silverlight 5 Data and Services Cookbook by another Silverlight Show presenter, Jill Clearing, and also the MVVM Survival Guide for Enterprise Architectures in Silverlight and WPF. So definitely check those out and go ahead and do your tweeting of webinar Silverlight Show as we go here. And the other one he mentioned is a discount on Telerik products. If you go to telerik.com/silverlight, you can get a 15% discount on the premium or ultimate collections. Just send an email to the address at the bottom, and these slides will be available as well for download. So Asina Woodward at telerik.com for your discount code. All right, quick background on myself. I am an architect at iDesign. We're a .NET architecture and design consulting and training company. I'm also a Microsoft regional director for the Mid-Atlantic region. That's basically Washington, D.C. and the surrounding states. And I'm a Silverlight MVP. Do a lot of writing and speaking. You can see the details on the right there. The important stuff here is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to ping me offline via email or Twitter if you have follow-up questions about the webcast or my article series. And you can also certainly post the related article series, which I have links to at the end, and I try to respond to all of those in the prompt fashion as well. Okay, so what we're going to go through here, again, if you're brand new to either of the technologies, I'll give a high-level overview of each one here. If you have been working with either technology, this will probably be a review for you. but it's important to cover these capabilities because that's really what we're talking about, is how the different capabilities of the two stacks mesh. So we'll go through what Prism's all about and what its key features are and what they're designed to address. Then we'll go through RIA Services in a similar fashion and talk about its features. And then we'll basically kind of break it down and say, what are the parts that come out of this, and parts being a generic term for any chunk of code, if you will, that becomes part of your solution architecture. What are the different parts that come into your client architecture from these two stacks, and how do they relate to one another, and where would you put them in your solution architecture? And at the end, we'll also kind of talk about some different ways to break in terms of the way Prism handles things, as well as the way WCF RIA Services requires you to handle things. So to get started here on the Prism side, Prism is a toolkit for composite apps. It was released by the Microsoft Patterns and Practices group, and as I mentioned, I work directly with the team there on versions 1 and 4, and they're soon going to be getting started on some new work that I'll also be involved in. The current release is version 4.1. You can find it out on MSDN. If you just search on Microsoft Prism 4, you'll find links to MSDN, or you can always go to prism.codeplex.com is sort of the home for it on Codeplex. What Prism really consists of is three main things. The first is the reusable class libraries that we'll be talking about today, that you'll make part of your solution to use the built-in functionality of Prism. But a big part of what Prism offers too is that there's a fairly dense pile of samples that come along with it in the form of quick starts and what they call reference implementations, which are really fairly complex sample applications with a business context. And those, not only show you how to use the code that exists in the Prism library, they also go beyond that and show you things like how would you factor your solution, and how would you implement things like the model view model pattern and things like that. So those are definitely a valuable resource that are part of the Prism shipping stuff, but they're not, officially part of the Prism reusable code, which is the library. Then also there's documentation, and in Prism 4, one of the things we did is we rewrote all of the documentation in book form. So the book is titled Developer's Guide to Microsoft Prism 4. It's available in print form through O'Reilly Press, or it's a free download as a PDF or a CHM file that you can download and just read if you want an electronic copy. The key features we'll be talking through in Prism here are modularity, UI composition, loosely coupled communications, which is composed of commands and events, navigation, and application structuring. And we'll talk through what each of those means and how it relates to your application architecture. So modularity is a feature in Prism that lets you break up the functionality in your application into separate modules, as they're called. And the modules are really nothing more than libraries as far as Silverlight's concerned, although you actually create them as a Silverlight application so that they get packaged up in their own ZAP file. And that lets you deploy those separately and download and load them separately into your application at runtime. And it allows you to very easily turn on and turn off features. For example, if your application has different feature sets that a customer has to pay a different amount to have access to, then it makes a nice clean line of separation to factor out that functionality into these separate modules that are loosely coupled from each other and also loosely coupled from the main application itself. And it allows you to do that breakup of the individual chunks of functionality and get them dynamically loaded at runtime. UI composition is part of the functionality of Prism, and it's there to address the fact that, just one second here, I see some flashing on my screen, just making sure. Okay, we're good. Sorry about that. So UI composition is a feature in Prism that addresses the ability to dynamically compose your views. So if you've got these modules and the chunks of code and functionality I'm talking about are out in these loosely coupled modules, you basically need a way to plug that functionality into the main application UI. And that includes plugging in the views. If you're doing the MVVM pattern, their view models, and any supporting code that sits behind the views. All needs to kind of be plugged into the main application. And in addition to just plugging into the main app, Prism does support kind of n levels deep of plugging views into other views within a loosely coupled fashion. And I'll show some of that in the sample solution when we get to it. The loosely coupled communication features of Prism are if you have these chunks of code, again, generally broken out into different modules, and they're not supposed to know anything about each other. There should be no references, project references between modules, for example. Then how can you have one view communicate with another one? And the way you do that generally is to use the commands and events that are part of the Prism framework. On the command side, there's two different command types, delegate command and composite command. And they follow the command pattern of WPF and Silverlight that allows you to hook up UI elements typically to handling code, and that can either be in the code behind, in a view model, or even more loosely coupled out in some client-side service. And basically you'll hook those things up. They allow you to do a direct hookup through a delegate command or a more indirect hookup, more of a almost a subscribe, unsubscribe type metaphor with the composite command. And it lets you get these invokers, as they're called in the command pattern, from the gang of 4, hooked up to the receivers, which is the handling code, which is somewhere loosely coupled in the behind code. The pub/sub events are another form of communication, and that's more for behind-the-scenes communication, typically view model to view model, or between services, or between view models and services. Typically not so much from the view itself. If it's some kind of user interaction that triggers communication, then it's typically going to be done with a command. But if something happens in the background, for example, you've added, through user interaction and a command, you've added something to a collection in one view model, a different view model may need to know about that. And so the pub/sub events are a way for one view model to publish and say that something of interest has occurred, and then some other view model or some number of view models can subscribe and listen to that. Okay, the navigation features of Prism are centered around the UI composition that I talked about. They're basically giving you the ability to switch views, not just plug the views in, but then dynamically switch which views are contained within something called a region. And the regions are kind of the UI plug point of the UI composition functionality that I talked about before. You identify a container control, something like a content control, a selector, or a items control as a region, and then you're able to plug views into that. Once you've plugged them in, you can also dynamically switch which views are contained by that region. And so navigation is a set of functionality that sits on top of regions that lets you have logic code that says now it's time to switch to this view or this view, and pass parameters to that view or its view model as the navigation occurs. It also allows the view to participate in the navigation to do things like prevent navigation if there's something that's yet to be done. For example, if the view needs to prompt the user, they can do that. Or if they just need to know when they've been navigated to so that they can populate their view, for example. The final thing is not so much a formal feature of Prism in the sense that there's direct code supporting this. It's more guidance around how to structure your application to have all this loose coupling I'm talking about and to leverage the features of Prism. So it gives you guidance on breaking your application down into something called a bootstrapper. And the bootstrapper is basically the initialization code for the application as a whole, but should be somewhat ignorant of what the gory details of how that app gets up and running and populates its data and so on. It really just initializes the container, the processes, or the modules that are going to load up, and gets everything kicked off. But it leaves it up to the individual modules to do their own initialization so that they can stay loosely coupled from the main application. So the modules are definitely a big part of the application architecture in a Prism application, because that's where most of your functionality will reside. The shell is a concept that is basically part of the application structure as well. It's basically your main window or your main page in Silverlight terms. where you load things into. And it's generally a single top-level view that everything is a child to in terms of the functioning of your application. But it should be, in Prism terms, it should be fairly ignorant of what it contains, because those things are dynamically plugged into it through the region functionality of Prism. Model view, view model, there is guidance and samples, as I mentioned before, on how to do that pattern in the Prism package, if you will. But there's actually very little code support, per se, in the Prism libraries for doing so. There's a few base classes you can derive from to get started, but MVVM on its own really doesn't require some dense framework to actually do it. It's more patterns that you follow in the code. So the samples and documentation, a couple of chapters in the book that I mentioned, cover the MVVM pattern and how to go about doing it. And then another part is this concept of services, and this is a heavily overloaded term here. It can be kind of confusing for people. When I say services in the context of this talk and in the context of Prism, I am talking about client-side services, not remote web services. These are just chunks of functionality that are accessible throughout the client process that are basically chunks of reusable code that are sort of application scope. They're typically singletons, and you normally will new them up through a container. It's based on the service locator pattern is where the term comes from. And if you haven't really been exposed to this before, it's nothing new. Things like Visual Studio have been doing this for years. It's the way the designers in Visual Studio pull in different sets of functionality themselves. But it's basically an in-process client-side chunk of functionality that you can access from anywhere within the application. So one of the most common types of client-side services is something like the repository pattern, and you'll see me refer to that later on. So often a view model, for example, in an MVVM app will go out through a repository on the client side, and the repository insulates the view model from needing to know how persistence happens, whether it's locally stored, whether it's cached on the client side, whether a web service call happens. All that's the business of the repository service, and the view models just say, give me data or save this data for me. The other thing the app structuring does is it gives you some guidance on these different layers of abstraction within your UI layer itself. So that's high-level, big picture summary of what Prism's all about, and we'll talk about the specific parts that brings into your application here shortly. Switching gears then and talking about RIA Services. RIA Services is part of the Silverlight framework itself. It ships with Silverlight, and basically it's a capability to make it so that you can easily build line of business applications that are focused on data, data-driven applications, if you will. And to do that, as you probably all know as Silverlight developers, that generally means you have to make service calls to go and get your data from the server side. But a lot of people in Silverlight development maybe aren't deep experts in WCF and building services on the server side and figuring out how to access them on the client side. So RIA Services puts some wrappers on it and makes it so when you design your app, you can focus on it much like the diagram in the slide currently shows, that you can think of things in terms of a two-tier kind of application. You should be breaking things down already, regardless of the architecture, into common layers such as presentation, business, and data access. But if you had a two-tier type application like this, think of a traditional WinForms app or even a WPF app that's designed as a two-tier app, talks directly to the database. These are fairly simple to put together and to understand how to structure things. It's really the service boundary that makes things complicated. So what WCF RIA Services does is it makes you able to sort of pretend you're working in this kind of an architecture. Even when you're working in a distributed architecture, it basically brings in some code on the server side that wraps your business logic and exposes it as services for you, along with the entities and any validation you have, and then it mirrors that representation on the client side, giving you service access, giving you client-side validation, and giving you client-side representations of those server-defined entities. And it does all this pretty transparently. If you want deep details on how RIA services work, you can go check out my 10-part article series on the Silverlight show and 4 other webinars I've done on RIA services. And I've got links to the 10-part series in the last slide here. But basically it makes it so you can focus on, in your UI layer, on just making very simple asynchronous calls that result in service calls and invoke the logic that's defined in your RIA domain services on the back end. One thing that's fairly new with RIA services, if you haven't heard of a library called Upshot, I mentioned down at the bottom the Silverlights, or the, clients that RIA services accommodates is mainly Silverlight at the current time. It was mostly designed for Silverlight clients. There is some capability in the RIA services toolkit to access your domain services, the server-side components of RIA services, from a ASP.NET server-side code behind. But the kind of new kid on the block is this Upshot library. It's currently out there in MVC4 beta. There is the general terminology is single-page applications, or SPAs, and Upshot library ships as part of that functionality. It's going to actually be split out with the next release, with the release candidate of MVC4, and it's going to be on its own timeline separate from MVC4. But the single-page application functionality includes both server-side and client-side, where the client-side HTML functionality, or really a client-side JavaScript library, is called Upshot. And Upshot allows you, one of the things it allows you to do is consume WCF RIA Services server-side code from JavaScript clients. So it extends the reach of your RIA services out to multi-platform HTML clients. Now, the general features of RIA services that we're focusing on here, the biggest one is querying and updating data from services. So it's very CRUD-oriented, doing create, read, update, and delete type operations on server-side data access. But you certainly can have some business logic and some validation logic that's being invoked on the client and server side as well. Part of the functionality there is that once you retrieve entities from the server side, they are retained, they're cached on the client side, and make it really easy to reuse those in multiple views on the client side and not have to go make multiple service calls to do that, even if those views are loosely coupled from one another. Once you've pulled entities down and you start making modifications, adding items to collections, deleting items from collections, the caching of those entities will also be change tracked, much like Entity Framework does. If you're holding a object context in Entity Framework and you start modifying the entities you retrieve through it, RIA Services gives you a similar model on the client side, and it will track those changes and make it so you can issue a single submit type of operation on the client side and get all the modified entities sent back to the server side for persistence. There's great validation capabilities in RIA services. When you start modifying those entities, you have the ability to use data annotations to indicate on both the client and server side what validation rules you have. Those will be checked first on the client side, and even if they pass on the client side, they will be re-evaluated on the server side, just in case someone is coming in not from a Silverlight client over your services. You still need to always make sure things are good before you persist it on the server side. So the validation there on data annotations is very rich. You can also tie in custom validation rules through the data annotations. You can do server-side validation, and basically you just throw exceptions back to the client side, and the client side will do the right thing basically and present those as validation errors on the client side rather than blowing up on you. And there's also an ability to make asynchronous calls back to the server side to do lookup type validation. Another feature of WCF RIA Services is some security functionality, and one of my previous webinars on Silverlight Show focuses entirely on that. Basically allows you to have a client-side security context, which does not exist in Silverlight natively. There is no concept of who is the authenticated user on the client side in the main Silverlight framework. But with RIA Services, you easily get access to that. You can do things like either join into a secure session that was established by the hosting website, or you can do the authentication from the client side in your Silverlight app, collect the user credentials and pass them on for validation on the back end. And then once you do, you know who the authenticated user is, and you can do authorization because you get back roles associated with that authenticated user. And in the server side of your RIA services, you can easily just declaratively, through attributes, say that you require authentication and that you require certain roles for access to your services, service methods rather. The final thing I mentioned there is that even though RIA Services is mostly about CRUD, you can define ad hoc methods on the server side and call those from the client side. I mentioned that in the context of validation a little while ago, but those methods could do just about anything, such as kick off a logical workflow on the back end, even if it's not a retrieval or a data update type scenario. All right, so that's the big picture of what Prism and WCF RIA Services is all about. If you've already been exposed, hopefully that was a good review. If not, hopefully that gives you the big picture of what those two technologies are for. Now what I wanted to talk about is, start breaking it down to what do you have in code as a result of using those frameworks, and then how do those things relate between the two frameworks. So starting back on the Prism side, one of the first things you'll create in the Prism app is something called a bootstrapper, which I mentioned before is the initialization code for the main application. The main responsibilities of the Prism bootstrapper is to set up the dependency injection container. One of the things you have to get used to if you're using Prism and you have not used dependency injection or inversion of control containers before is that you will be using them in Prism because Prism itself uses them under the covers. Prism ships out of the box with support for the Unity and Managed Extensibility or MEF frameworks containers, but it also supports plugging in any containers such as Ninject or Castle Windsor. You just have to write a little bit of shim code on top of the iService locator interface to be able to bring in a different container. The other thing the bootstrapper does besides setting up the container is to initialize the Prism services. So some of the other features I mentioned, such as UI composition and the pub sub events, require some, and module loading, require some service functionality, client-side services that take care of that stuff for you. So the bootstrapper initializes those things. The bootstrapper is also responsible for creating and presenting your main window, the shell, or your main page.xaml in Silverlight terms. And naturally that's going to be something you define in your application. Prism itself can't do that, but it basically just has a base class that calls your derived class override. And then the other thing you will define is what modules do you have that you want loaded up. And part of the module definitions is some metadata that says, do I want to load it immediately as the application starts up, or do I want to defer loading it until it's actually invoked? So all that stuff sounds like a lot, but it's basically mostly encapsulated in a base class in Prism, either a MEF bootstrapper if you're using MEF, or a Unity bootstrapper if you're using Unity, and you would write something similar if you were going to use a different container. And it encapsulates the default workflow I just talked about and just calls into some overrides in a derived class that you'll define for what exactly is your shell and what is required to initialize it, and what modules do you want to load in your derived class. So that's the concept of a bootstrapper. The shell, as I mentioned, is really just your main page in Silverlight, and it's mostly going to be an empty layout container. It'll have a couple of top-level containers, typically some content controls, maybe items controls as the top-level layout for things like maybe a toolbar or a left navigation panel, and then a main content area. But it's basically going to have no idea itself what goes into those regions. It just defines that top-level layout, and it might pull in some common styles for the application through resources. The modules are where the action happens in a Prism application. So you're going to break down your functionality into these silos that are generally oriented around functional lines that break down different sets of functionality in your application, as I mentioned before. The things that a module typically contains, the module itself is a code artifact in itself in that it will be a project within your solution, whereas the bootstrapper that I mentioned first, that's just a class in your main application project, and the shell is just a XAML and code behind in your main application. But the module itself is a project within your solution. And inside of that project, it's typically going to contain some set of views. They're supporting view models if you're doing the MVVM pattern, and possibly client services such as repositories if you're going to include those in your application. They'll also potentially contain the code required to do web service access. So as opposed to these client-side services, you're going to have to go out to the server side and make web service calls. And so proxies in WCF terms could live within your module itself. Now we're going to see that when you use RIA services, there's a slightly better way to go about things, and you would typically not put it in the module itself. In addition to that, you typically need some shared functionality. So I mentioned before that modules in a Prism application should always be loosely coupled from one another. They should not take direct references on each other. But you're going to need some shared functionality between them to define things like interfaces, abstractions that the multiple modules depend on, events that they're firing between each other, commands that they may participate in, and constants for things like region names. So usually you'll have one to maybe a few shared libraries. These are just Silverlight class libraries that you'll reference from all the modules and possibly from the shell as well. The WCF on the server side, what we've got is a domain service. The domain service is your initial point of focus when you're WCF RIA Services, and it's basically a class that derives from a RIA service-based class, and it's the thing that will kind of implicitly be exposed as a web service called by the client side. But as I showed in that earlier diagram, there's some infrastructure that sits on top of your domain service that does the exposure as a web service or a WCF service. But that's where you're going to put your functionality to retrieve and update and insert and delete your entities, as well as any ad hoc server methods that you define. So that's just a class in a server-side library or the main server-side hosting web project. The entities are certainly an important part, since it's CRUD-focused, is what is the data, the properties that you're going to be passing back and forth across the wire. So those can come in the form of just any plain old CLR object or POCO. They can also come in the form of entity framework entities that are defined through code generation with the entity framework. Then you can also define what are called shared code files, and there's a naming convention for these where you call them .shared.cs or .shared.vb, and they basically will be automatically copied. So you first focus on, what is the code that the server side needs, and then decide, can that same code be invoked on the client side if it was available there? And if the answer is yes, you can put it in these shared files, and they will get code generated to the client side so that you can call that same code on the client side. That's especially handy for things like validation code that you want to enforce both on the client and server side. On the client side, you don't explicitly write any of the things I'm going to talk about here. These are all code generated for you by the RIA Services framework when you compile your project. So once you've defined those things I just talked about on the server side, you hit compile, and these things get generated on the client side. The domain context is the thing that's like a WCF proxy that lets you make the calls to the server. Underneath the domain context is where some of the magic I was talking about happens in terms of caching the entities that are retrieved and change tracking any modifications made to them. The entity class definition, so the domain context is a class that gets code generated on the client side, one for each domain service that you expose. And there's a one-to-one relationship that's important in the architecture we'll talk about in the diagram shortly. The entities are really just client-side versions of the server-side entity definitions. They're different in that they have a different base class that provides some client-side support for things like the iNotify property change interface, as well as validation functionality with the iNotify data error info interface. Then there's that shared code I just talked about. If you have it on the server side, it will be copied to the client side and you can invoke it. And then the fourth piece is this thing called a web context, which is the thing that provides that client-side security context that I talked about a little while ago. So it lets you use it for authentication, authorization, and user identity access, as well as user preferences or custom user information. All right, so finally some architecture diagrams, and then we'll get to the code. That I talked about before is going to live in your main project, and we typically refer to that as your shell project. That's that startup code, the place that your app.xaml and your main page.xaml live. And the main page.xaml is what represents the shell. That's where you're going to put your bootstrapper, and that's the thing that's going to kick things off and get the application running. Now, neither one of those really needs to know anything about WCF RIA Services. That's kind of lower down in the stack, and we'll talk about that shortly here. Now, part of the Prism startup process, as I mentioned, is that the bootstrapper will identify what modules you want to load into your application, where the real functionality, the views, view models, and their supporting code, where those things live. So on the right, I show a collection of modules with views, view models, and services within them, all self-contained and in sort of silos of functionality. The views from a module will get plugged into the shell, and I show a dashed line there to represent that plugin process, typically using the region functionality, the UI composition of Prism. But the view models themselves and the services, that's where RIA Services starts to tie in. So, first sticking purely to the Prism side, over on the left I show a shared library project that I talked about. That's typically where you'll define these artifacts like events, event classes, composite command, instances, interfaces, and constants that are shared across all the modules. So I have an arrow there representing a dependency that all of the modules will typically depend on that shared library. Then the other thing I show here is where RIA starts to plug into this is, on the client side, I mentioned the 4 types of code that are generated by RIA: domain context, entities, shared code, and web context. Those are really just support classes, things that, think of them as the layer just above the service boundary that you're going to call out to the service boundary with. Now, certainly parts of that, the entities in particular, propagate up into the UI layer and get presented by the views. But to consume this stuff, you basically just have to have those in a library that you can reference from the modules that depend on them. And typically it's going to be the view models that consume that stuff, or possibly the client-side services. Things like a repository service would be the thing that would actually make the service calls and provide access to the entities that come back to the view models. Now I show it here as a separate class library from the shared library. There's no reason they necessarily have to be separate, but I just find that to keep kind of different concerns separated, I prefer to put them in separate libraries, and you'll see that in the solution I'm going to show. The next thing I wanted to show here, if I can get PowerPoint to respond, is just kind of more in words what I just talked about. So the domain context is going to be consumed by your view models and by your client-side services. It's the thing you make load calls to retrieve data and submit change calls on to pass updates to the data. It also exposes any of the ad hoc operations from your domain service. It exposes those as service methods that you can invoke asynchronously. So it's much like a WCF proxy in that sense, and it can be directly invoked by your view models or client services. The entities are the things that more directly propagate throughout your UI layer because they're going to be retrieved through a domain context and cached by that domain context, but you can get references to those entities or those entity collections and expose those as properties on the view model itself, and then the views themselves can bind to those entity collections or individual entities and present the properties from those entities as fields within the views. So the entities flow throughout the UI layer, but they're typically just going to be a reference to an object that is sort of owned by the domain context, and that will be able to pass updates and things back to the server side if appropriate. The shared code Most of the time you don't directly interact with that. The most common usage of that, as I mentioned, is for custom validation roles, and that will typically be transparently invoked by the domain context whenever it sees that or really the entity base class, whenever it sees that a property on an entity has been changed. And if there's a validation rule associated with that tied in through data validation rule through a shared code. But you could actually have little computational chunks of code or things like that that you could share between the client and server side and explicitly invoke those from either your view model or your client-side service. The last piece here, web context, typically that's the only piece that might touch your bootstrapper. Is there some initialization that has to happen as the app starts up with the web context, basically specifying whether you're doing forms authentication or Windows authentication and getting that web context populated. The most logical place to put that is in the bootstrapper itself. But the usage of it to do things like role checking and to get the user's identity and do some personalization based on that is typically going to be buried down in your view models, views, and client services. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about here in diagrams before we get to the solution is just what it looks like in terms of these class libraries. In the previous client library project, the fact is on the server side, you may have any number of domain services, and you may choose to break those out into individual service libraries on the server side. Those will still be hosted by a single web app, typically that your Silverlight app is also hosted from. It could be a totally separate site, but that gets into topics that we don't have time to talk about here. If you go to part 10, I believe it is, of my RIA Services series, I talk a little bit about that. But typically, if you have a big complicated application with lots and lots of domain services, you may want to break those down into their own domain service class libraries and have multiple libraries on the server side. One thing that's important about RIA Services is it does have this requirement of a one-to-one relationship between a client-side library and a server-side library. So I represent that here by having 3 separate class libraries on the client side, 3 separate service libraries on the server side. You don't necessarily have to factor it that way. You could actually have one client-side library that points to 3 separate server-side domain libraries. But typically you want to keep, if you want that factoring on the back end, you probably want the same factoring on the front end to keep it all straight. So there's no reason you can't break down multiple class libraries, set up the RIA of concepts. Let's go to a example in code here. So I'm going to bring up a virtual machine that has a solution in it. This is actually the finished code solution for part 4 of my Prism series, and I happen to use RIA Services in it, to retrieve the data. So looking at the solution, let me explain at a project level breakdown, and then we'll look at the relationships between them. We've got the hosting web project that the Silverlight app is host out of, and it's also the host for the RIA domain services. We've got the main Prism app, or a main Silverlight application, which is this Prism 101 app. It's called that because I start in the first part of the Prism series and just keep the same project evolving throughout the series. And you can see that this is where the bootstrapper lives, where the main page.xaml and the app.xaml live, like a normal Silverlight app. And also a module catalog, which is one of the ways that you can indicate to Prism what modules you want to load up in the application. Then this app has 2 separate modules that exposes some functionality about customers. And then there's an orders one that exposes orders information naturally. And you can see that contain views, view models, and in this case there are no services, no repositories, but those could also go into one or more of these modules. Then the shared library I talked about, that is more the Prism shared library, if you will, where it has some pub/sub events defined and composite commands defined at a file level. And then over here you can see the RIA client library. And if you look at this, what might look a little weird is you have a class library that appears to have no code whatsoever. But in fact it does. Once you compile this solution, or more specifically, once you define, let me expand my web project here. Once I define a domain service as part of my host web project, the code generation I talk about is going to happen when I build this solution. And once it's been built, that client library, in its project properties, the thing that ties them together and provides that one-to-one relationship I talked about is this WCF RIA Services link down here in the project properties. And you can see that's pointing to the web project. So that sets up that one-to-one relationship, in this case, between the web project and its contained domain services and this RIA client library. So it means this RIA client library is the place that the code generation is going to happen. And so if I show all files in Solution Explorer, you'll see there really is code there. It's just not code that you're writing. RIA Services is writing all of it for you. And if I open up this web.g.cs file, we will see, if I drop down the type selector at the top, you'll see this is where the domain context lives, the entity types for customer and order, and not shown here because I didn't do security in this app is a web context would also be here as well. And so you have that code generation of those different artifact types. This app is also not using any shared code, but if we had shared code, those would show up as separate files under the generated code folder here. So it looks a little weird if you don't show all files, because you'll have a project in your solution with no files in it apparently, but it's a place for the code gen to happen. And it also means that any of the modules that need to depend on those services can simply take a normal project reference. So you can see here that this module has a project reference there, and this module here has the same project reference there. Okay, so that's where those relationships shown in that previous diagram start to come in, is that we have these modules and the shell application, which is Prism 101, all depend on the shared library for Prism artifacts, and then this module and this module depend on this RIA client library for service access. So that's where these things all come together at a solution level. Now, some of the lower level artifacts I talked about, view model of domain context, for example. We don't have a lot of time to dive into this, and some of my other webinars and article series cover this in depth. But just to give you a quick sense of that, I mentioned navigation functionality of Prism. Here's some of that happening where this view can participate and confirm whether navigation should occur, and when it's navigated to, it's passed some information through this navigation aware interface. It has access when needed somewhere down below. I take it back. I'm looking at the wrong view to be doing this. I need the list view model. Is the one that actually you can see has a reference or an instance of a RIA Services domain context in it. And when it needs to go and retrieve data, it issues a load operation on that context object, and that's what retrieves entities back and caches them on the client side. And then it exposes, down below here, it exposes those customers from the domain context as a property on the view model so that the view can bind to it. So this IEnumerable of customers is nothing more. You can see on the load complete handler, you can see that all we do is we populate our customer's property with a reference to the customer's collection that's exposed by the domain context. So we're really just exposing references that are not copies of the objects or the collections. We let the domain context be the owner of those entities so it can do its change tracking on them. And the that I mentioned, the web context is not in this sample, but it would go basically up here in the bootstrapper. As the shell is being initialized here, this is where the shell gets set up. You create your main page and show it by setting it as the root visual. Instead of doing it in the app.xaml, normally you would have a startup URI in your app.xaml that does this. you do it more explicitly in a Prism app. Notice there's no startup URI. You do it explicitly in the Bootstrapper in a Prism application. And waiting for Visual Studio to respond here. So those are the core concepts. That's how they get tied together, where they exist within the code and in the code artifacts, and kind of how to structure things. So with that, I'm going to come out of my virtual machine here and go look at the questions, and I'll take any questions that exist here. Email, if you can go ahead and start forwarding me the questions.
Yeah, okay. Let's wait for the questions, as there aren't any at the moment.
Okay, I'll go back to the slides here about the giveaways while people are queuing up questions.
Okay, so let's move to the short Q&A session. If you have some questions, please ask in the chat option. Okay, there are a couple of questions, so I will just assign them to Brian.
Okay, great question here. So we have a question: can you use Prism with WinForms? The official Microsoft answer would be no. It was originally, when we first started on Prism, we kind of wanted to be able to support it there. There's a previous framework you may have been exposed to called Composite UI Application Block that was a predecessor to Prism and addressed many of the same concerns. It had commands, it had pub/sub events, it had some ability to plug views in, and the similar concept of modules. So that's one option, is you could go back and use the Composite UI Application Block, but that framework was kind of heavyweight and a lot of people didn't like it. So the unofficial answer here from me is that shortly after we were in particular, WinForms doesn't have a concept of commands, so there is no iCommand interface in WinForms, so that one is kind of out. But what I did is I went and created a version of Prism 1 that works with WinForms. I have not gone back and updated that for Prism 4, but it would be fairly trivial to do so. The place that you can find that, let me just pop up Notepad here real quick. If you go out to Prism, or no, I'm sorry, it's actually under WPF, what did we call it? Composite WPF Contrib, I believe it is. It's been a long time. Composite WPF Contrib.codeplex.com. And if you can't locate it, shoot me an email and I'll point you to it. But that has this version I'm talking about that's a ported version of the Prism framework that works with WinForms. Okay, the next question here. Any idea if there is a place for RIA to work in WPF? Boy, I wish. I've talked to the RIA Services team a bunch of times, and it's always been on their short list of things they'd like to do, is have RIA Services support in WPF. It's just never made the cut because initially WPF was not getting any love, if you will, from the framework teams, and everything was going into Silverlight, and now the roles have reversed a little bit, and Silverlight's just kind of lingering. I would be surprised, to be honest, if they backported RIA Services to WPF, unfortunately. The only way you can consume it in WPF would be if you look at part 10 of my article series. I talk about the ability to expose either a SOAP-based normal WCF service that is consumable by any platform that can handle basically a basic HTTP binding in WCF. So WPF is certainly one of those. The other thing you can do is expose a REST-based JSON formatted endpoint that you could consume from WPF. But you basically wouldn't get any of that rich client-side stuff I talked about. You wouldn't have domain context. You wouldn't have the client-side caching and change tracking and all that. You would have to do all that kind of stuff yourself. But you could at least access the services that way. Okay, next one, can you use assembly caching with Prism? Excellent question, and brings up a point that I need to go back to my virtual machine to address. So one important thing that I didn't highlight here is when you're using Prism in a project like I showed here, the important thing here when I go to the Solution Explorer is, sorry, I'm kind of getting confused focus here. There we go. Okay, so when you look at the references I have in the modules, the challenge you have here is we need to reference certain things such as that shared library and that RIA client library from multiple modules. These modules, as I mentioned before, are actually set up when you create them as a Silverlight application, not a Silverlight class library. But then you can see I have my startup object set to not set, and there is no, I delete off basically the app.xaml and the main page.xaml. So it's acting like a class library, but it technically is a Silverlight application project and gets compiled into its own ZAP. That means that any of its referenced libraries will get compiled into that same ZAP. And that would mean you would actually get multiple copies trying to load in on the client side as these modules load up. And so the way you address that is that you, actually not so much for those two, but it's very important to do this for the Prism libraries themselves, but I should actually also do it for these shared libraries. Notice the Prism libraries, I have copy local set to false, and it's actually not using a GAC assembly. So it basically makes it so for compilation purposes the code will be there, but in the compiled ZAP that results the XAP file, those libraries will not be embedded in that XAP file. But on the main application, the Prism 101 up here, notice copy local is true. So you want to make sure that only one copy gets there. It's a little more manual than doing the reduce ZAP file. The question was what's called the space in the name of it here. I'll go back to the question in a moment. But checking this box for reducing ZAP file will be the application library caching. That was the term. Basically prevents duplicate copies normally from being downloaded to the client side. But in this case, you have to do it a little bit more manually for those Prism libraries. It doesn't directly support that unless in the Prism libraries themselves, if I go out to where Prism resides in this project, just give me a second here to go to the desktop, to the project. Here's where the Prism library exists. I'm bringing it in as a project here. You can see that I've got the Prism projects in here. If I do it instead of doing it as project references, if I use the binaries that ship with Prism, they do have the support in there for application library caching. So if I did these as binary references instead of project references, then reduce that file by using application library caching would in fact work. All right, let me go back to the Q&A here. There's the panel. All right. What is the difference between WCF RIA Services and WCF Data Services? That's a can of worms itself. And then the question is, what's the difference between WCF and WCF RIA Services and WCF Data Services and the new thing that's called the ASP.NET Web API? These are all different approaches for exposing service functionality to clients. RIA Services is fine-tuned for the functionality I covered here. Data Services is all about exposing an entity data model. Typically, it can be some other link provider, but mostly used within a framework for direct consumption of your data access layer, basically, with no intervening logic typically. So Data Services uses the OData protocol. RIA Services has some ability to expose OData for read-only. Data Services supports write, update, insert, delete type functionality. So there is a lot of overlap conceptually in that they're both CRUD-oriented. RIA Services uses an efficient binary formatting by default with Silverlight clients. Data Services is going to use the OData protocol. So it's really that Data Services is for broad reach, many different platforms consuming your data directly. RIA Services is more of this kind of vertical stack pipeline with client-side functionality and server-side functionality that's all designed to work together. All right, next question. How can we implement security over WCF RIA Services, which is consumed by our code using Prism architecture? Prism wouldn't have much direct play in that, other than, as I mentioned, the setup of the web context could happen within your Bootstrapper. If you go to my previous webinar, I believe it was actually May of last year, you can find that as a prominent link on the Silverlight show. It is on Silverlight 5, Security and Personalization is in the title of that, and it covers the RIA Services security functionality. And it's also part 7 of my article series that I have a link to here at the end. So let me go to the links here so you can see those on my desktop there. So that article, those 2 article series I was referring to, there's the link to part 1, and part 1 has links to all the other parts. So part 7 of the RIA Services series, or a webinar that you can find links to on those same article series. All right, let's see here. Next question. We're just about out of time. I'll do one more here and we'll wrap up. Does RIA Services work with MVC? Absolutely. I assume there you mean ASP.NET MVC. You could consume from the server side, you could consume domain services directly. It wouldn't so much be a service consumption at that point. It's more an in-process consumption of the domain services. But there is a capability with the RIA Services Toolkit to do that. Otherwise, other than on the client side with this new upshot library I talked about, you could definitely consume RIA Services from there as well. And I've got an article coming up in Code Magazine on this upshot library and the single-page application functionality. I was also planning on writing one here for the Silverlight show talking about the specific consumption of RIA domain services. All right, with that, we may have a few more questions there, but we're kind of out of time. We will answer those offline by email. Follow up with you folks that didn't get your questions answered, and I'll hand it back over to Emil here.
Okay, thanks Brian. Thanks for this webinar. This has been another great session on WCF RIA Services. Thanks everyone for attending. I invite you to fill in our survey displayed right now just after you exit the webinar. 3 of you will win Brian's ebook on working with Prism 4. A recording of this webinar as well as all the demos and slides will be made available to you and emailed within the next few days. Thanks again for attending and have a good day. Bye.